Close your eyes and imagine a British road in 1955. You see a Jaguar XK140 or a Morris Minor. These cars are beautiful. They are symbols of post-war success and engineering pride. They are made of heavy, thick British steel, but that steel was a lie. In 1955, there were no mandatory seatbelts. There were no standardized crash tests. Your dashboard was a wall of unpadded metal. Your steering wheel was a spear aimed at your chest. Therefore, if you crashed at just 30 miles per hour, your beautiful car didn't protect you. It became a high-speed execution chamber. This is not a story about car parts. It is a story about a decades-long war. A war between the laws of physics and the stubbornness of the human mind. It is the story of how the British government stopped being polite and started using trauma and grim psychological warfare to force its citizens to survive their own pride. In the middle of the 1950s, the British motor industry was at its peak. We were the second largest car producer in the world. We were exporting to every corner of the globe. But there was a dark secret hidden beneath the chrome and the leather. The engineers of the time believed in a dangerous myth. They believed that a car should be as rigid as possible. They thought that if the car didn't brake, the passenger wouldn't brake. But the laws of physics do not care about British craftsmanship. Therefore, when a rigid car hits a brick wall, it stops instantly, but the human body inside does not stop. It continues at the same speed until it hits the dashboard, the windshield, or the steering column. Therefore, in 1955, every car on the road was essentially a glorified guillotine. The problem was that no one was talking about it. Manufacturers were terrified of the word safety. There was an unspoken rule in the industry. If you talk about safety, you are reminding the buyer that they might die. But death was becoming too common to ignore. By the late 50s, the death toll on British roads was reaching a crisis point. But the public didn't blame the cars. They blamed the driver's skill. They blamed the weather. They blamed bad luck. The car itself was seen as a safe haven. It was your private property, your castle on wheels. Therefore, the idea that the government should tell you how to sit in your own car was seen as an outrageous violation of liberty. But then, the data started to trickle in from a place called MIRA, the Motor Industry Research Association. In the early days, their crash tests were brutal and primitive. They would tow a car down a track and slam it into a 100-ton concrete block. There were no high-tech dummies yet. Sometimes they used sandbags, sometimes they used nothing. But the results were always the same. The cars survived, but the interiors were destroyed by the invisible force of inertia. Therefore, the engineers realized they had a problem that they couldn't solve with thicker steel. They needed a way to tether the human to the machine. In 1959, Volvo introduced the 3-point seatbelt. It was a masterpiece of simplicity, but the British public wasn't impressed. They looked at the belt and saw a straitjacket. They saw a nuisance. They even invented myths to justify their fear. People claimed that it was better to be thrown clear of a crash. They told stories of people trapped in burning cars because of their seatbelts. These were lies, but they were powerful lies. Therefore, the government realized that logic wouldn't work. They needed to change the national mindset. But how do you change the mind of a nation that prides itself on being stubborn? The answer came in 1963 with the You Know It Makes Sense campaign. This was the first time the government used the power of the television to sell safety. They brought in celebrities. They tried to be your friend. They used a polite, instructional tone, but the statistics didn't move. People watched the ads, and then they got into their cars and left the belts dangling. The belts were seen as an uncool accessory for the paranoid. Therefore, the government had to escalate. They realized that if being a friend didn't work, they would have to become a nightmare. As we moved into the late 60s, the tone of the campaigns changed. They stopped being polite. They started showing the reality of the second collision. This is the moment when your body hits the interior of the car. They showed slow-motion footage of faces hitting glass. They showed the physics of a child being thrown from the back seat like a projectile. But even then, the law lagged behind the science. In 1968, the government finally made it mandatory for manufacturers to fit seatbelts in the front of all new cars. But there was a catch, a massive, deadly catch. They made the manufacturers install them, but they didn't make the drivers wear them. Therefore, you had millions of cars on the road with life-saving technology that was being used as a footrest or tucked behind the seat. This created a strange, psychological limbo. The technology was there, the science was settled, but the culture was paralyzed. The British public viewed the seatbelt as a suggestion, not a necessity. But the death toll kept climbing. Therefore, the 1970s became the era of the shock campaign. This was the birth of the grim TV era. The government hired filmmakers to create public information films that felt like horror movies. They wanted to ruin your evening. They wanted you to feel the snap of the neck and the shatter of the teeth every time you saw a car. They wanted to create a visceral, physical reaction to the act of not wearing a belt. One of the most famous campaigns was clunk click every trip. It sounds catchy. It sounds like a jingle, but the visuals were anything but catchy. They showed a man's face being reconstructed by surgeons after a crash. They showed the human cost in a way that was almost unbearable to watch, but the resistance remained. There were members of Parliament who argued that a mandatory seatbelt law would be the end of British democracy. They said it was the nanny state gone mad. Therefore, for over a decade, the government and the public were locked in a stalemate. The government used trauma to try and force a habit, and the public used the excuse of freedom to keep dying. But the science was getting harder to ignore. By the mid-70s, the TRL, the Transport and Road Research Laboratory, was producing data that showed that wearing a seatbelt reduced your chance of death or serious injury by nearly 50%. Therefore, the argument was no longer about opinion. It was about math. But the math didn't matter to the man who didn't want a strap across his chest. The conflict had moved from the laboratory to the House of Commons. Between 1970 and 1982, there were 11 separate attempts to pass a mandatory seatbelt law in Britain. Every single time, the bill was defeated or stalled. But why? Why would a society choose to keep its citizens in danger? The answer lies in the unique British obsession with the individual. The car was the last place where a man felt he was truly in control. Outside, there were speed limits and traffic lights, but inside the cabin, he was the king. Therefore, the seatbelt was seen as a symbol of the government reaching into his private life and clicking a lock. But while the politicians debated philosophy, the hospitals were overflowing. Surgeons were the ones seeing the reality of the 1955 engineering philosophy. They were the ones pulling shards of steering wheels out of chests. Therefore, the medical community became the secret weapon of the safety movement. They stopped talking about accidents and started talking about preventable trauma. The final push began in the early 1980s. The grim campaigns had finally done their work. They had created a sense of unease. Even if you didn't wear your belt, you felt a slight twinge of guilt. You felt the ghost of the clunk-click ad in the back of your mind. But the law was still the missing piece. In 1981, a new amendment was finally pushed through, but it didn't happen overnight. There was a period of grace, a period where the nation had to prepare for the biggest change in motoring history since the invention of the driving test. On January 31, 1983, the era of freedom to die officially ended. The law changed. Suddenly, not wearing a belt wasn't just unwise. It was a crime. But the most amazing thing wasn't the law itself. It was what happened the next day. The compliance rate didn't go up by 10%. It didn't go up by 20%. It skyrocketed from around 30% to 95% almost instantly. Therefore, we have to ask, was it the law that changed the behavior? Or was it the 20 years of trauma on the television that had finally broken the resistance? Today, we look back at 1955 and we see a different world. We see a world that was beautiful but blind. We see cars that were works of art, but also instruments of tragedy. But we also see the power of the dance between technology and psychology. We see that safety isn't just about a nylon strap or a crumple zone. It is about the stories we tell ourselves. In 1955, the story was that we were invincible. By 1983, the story was that we were fragile. And in that shift from pride to fragility, thousands of lives were saved. But to understand why the British public was so resistant, we have to look closer at the machines they loved. The 1955 Austin A30 or the Morris Minor weren't just cars. They were triumphs of post-war optimism. They were built with a philosophy that seems alien to us today. Engineers at the time believed that if you built a car like a tank, the person inside would be as safe as a soldier. Therefore, they used heavy-gauge steel and rigid chassis frames. But this was the great engineering fallacy of the 20th century. When a rigid car hits an object, the energy of that impact has to go somewhere. In a modern car, the front of the vehicle crumples like an accordion, absorbing that energy. But in 1955, the car didn't crumple. It stayed perfectly, stubbornly intact. Therefore, the entire force of the collision was transferred directly into the soft tissue and brittle bones of the driver. If you were driving a 1955 Hillman Minx and hit a wall at 40 miles per hour, the car might look repairable afterward. But you wouldn't be. The steering column, a solid steel rod, would be pushed back by the engine block. It didn't collapse. It didn't bend. Therefore, it acted as a spear, puncturing the driver's chest before they even had time to blink. This was the spear effect, and it was a standard feature of almost every British car on the road. But the horror didn't stop there. The interiors were a gallery of hazards. Dashboards were made of painted metal or polished wood, beautiful to look at, but lethal upon impact. Toggle switches were shaped like little knives. Sun visors were held in place by sharp metal brackets. Therefore, even if you survived the initial impact, the interior of your own car would finish the job. By the early 1960s, a few researchers at MIRA and the Road Research Laboratory began to realize that they weren't just fighting bad driving. They were fighting bad physics. They started to use the first primitive crash test dummies, crude mannequins made of wood and rubber. But even these simple tools told a terrifying story. They showed that in a crash, a passenger's head would travel forward with enough force to shatter a toughened glass windshield. But the glass wouldn't just break, it would explode into thousands of razor-sharp shards. Therefore, survivors of 1950s crashes often spent the rest of their lives with horrific facial scarring. But the public still wasn't convinced. They saw these tests as extreme cases that didn't apply to their Sunday drive to the countryside. Therefore, the government realized it had to change the narrative from engineering to consequence. This led to the birth of the most aggressive propaganda campaign in British history. In the mid-1960s, the films started to get darker. They moved away from the polite advice of the 50s. They started to use the story lens of the hospital bed. They interviewed surgeons who described, in graphic detail, what it was like to remove a steering wheel from a man's sternum. But the resistance was cultural. There was a pervasive belief that a real man didn't need a seatbelt. It was seen as cowardly, or at the very least, uncool. Therefore, the government decided to target the one thing more powerful than pride: fear. In 1971, the Clunk Click Every Trip campaign was launched. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The ads didn't just tell you to wear a belt. They showed you what happened if you didn't. They used high-speed cameras to show the human projectile effect. You would see a man sitting in a car, looking perfectly normal. Then, the car would stop. You would see his body lift off the seat. You would see his head deform. It hit the glass. You would hear the sound of the glass breaking, a sound that was amplified in the edit to sound like a gunshot. Therefore, the click of the seatbelt was no longer just a sound. It was the sound of safety, contrasted against the clunk of an impact. But even this wasn't enough to change the law. The 1970s in Britain were a time of intense political turmoil. There were strikes, power cuts, and a growing distrust of government overreach. Therefore, when politicians suggested making seatbelts mandatory, they were met with a wall of libertarian fire. Critics argued that if a man wanted to risk his own life in his own car, that was his business. They called it the right to be foolish, but the government had a counter-argument. They pointed to the National Health Service. They argued that a private accident wasn't private at all. It cost the taxpayer thousands of pounds in surgery, rehabilitation, and lost productivity. Therefore, the seatbelt was no longer a matter of personal choice. It was a matter of national economy. But the most effective tool in the government's arsenal wasn't a politician. It was the elephant in the backseat ad. This was a stroke of storytelling genius. The ad explained that in a crash of 30 miles per hour, an unbelted passenger in the back seat is thrown forward with the weight of an elephant. They showed a young man sitting behind his mother, who was driving. They hit a wall, the son flies forward. He doesn't just die. He crushed his mother against the steering wheel. The tagline was haunting. It's the passenger who hasn't got a seatbelt on who does the damage. Therefore, the government shifted the guilt. It wasn't just about your life anymore. It was about the fact that your body could become the weapon that kills your own family. Despite these powerful images, the political battle dragged on. Between 1973 and 1981, the mandatory seatbelt bill was introduced to Parliament 11 times. 11 times, it was talked out, delayed, or defeated. Some MPs argued that seatbelts could trap you in a car. It fell into a river scenario that happened in less than 0.01% of accidents. But the fear was real. People preferred the imaginary danger of being trapped to the very real danger of being launched through a windshield. Therefore, the scientists had to get even more specific. They started to release data from real-world accidents, comparing belted survivors to unbelted fatalities in identical cars. The evidence was overwhelming. In every single case, the belt was the difference between a headache and a funeral. By the dawn of the 1980s, the tone of the country had shifted. The grim campaigns had finally worn down the public's defenses. A generation of children had grown up watching these terrifying films on Saturday mornings. To them, the seatbelt wasn't a restriction of liberty. It was as natural as wearing shoes. Therefore, the cultural momentum had finally shifted in favor of the law. When the bill was finally passed in 1982, it wasn't a moment of triumph so much as a moment of exhausted relief. The government had spent 20 years traumatizing the public into staying alive, but the work wasn't done. The law was set to go live on January 31, 1983. In the months leading up to it, there was a frantic scramble. People who had driven for 30 years without ever touching a seatbelt suddenly had to learn how to use them. Mechanics were overwhelmed, as thousands of owners of older cars, those built before 1968, rushed to have belts retrofitted. But there was still a lingering question. Would the police actually enforce it? Would the public actually obey? Some predicted a revolution on the motorways. They thought people would cut the belts out of their cars in protest. But when the day finally arrived, something miraculous happened. The butt of the story is that there was no revolution. Instead, there was a quiet, national click. The compliance rate went from less than 40% to over 90% in a single week. Therefore, we realized that the law wasn't the cause of the change. It was the final seal on a change that had already happened in the minds of the people. The grim films had done their job. They had planted a seed of doubt that only a seatbelt could soothe. But the 1983 law was only for the front seats. Therefore, The war had to continue. The government had won the battle for the driver, but the children in the back were still projectiles. This led to a whole new era of testing and campaigning. They had to prove that the back seat wasn't a safe zone. They had to show that a child sitting on a cushion was just as vulnerable as a driver hitting a dashboard. But the foundation had been laid. The British public had finally accepted the most important lesson of the 20th century, that a beautiful car is just a machine, and a machine must be tamed by physics. As we look at the ruins of those 1955 Austins today, we see more than just rust. We see a philosophy that died so that we could live. We see the end of the era of safe chrome. We see the moment when Britain decided that survival was more important than the feeling of being free to hit a windshield. But the most haunting part of the story is how easily we forget. Today, we sit in cars with 10 airbags, pre-tensioned belts, and autonomous braking. We feel invincible, just like the drivers did in 1955, but the physics haven't changed. The energy is still there, waiting for a moment of inattention. Therefore, the grim films of the 70s are still relevant today, because the only thing standing between us and the spear effect of the past is a simple, 3-point click. But the law of 1983, while a massive legislative victory, was only the conclusion of the first chapter in a much longer and more complex war. When the clock struck midnight on January 31, 1983, over 90% of British drivers complied almost instantly. It was a statistical miracle. However, as the months passed, a new and haunting pattern began to emerge in the emergency rooms of the NHS. Drivers and front seat passengers were surviving crashes that would have been fatal only a year prior. But there was a catch. The passengers in the back seats, mostly children, were still suffering catastrophic injuries. At the time, the British public viewed the back seats as a magic zone of safety. They believed that because they were behind a padded front seat, they were protected by a physical barrier. Therefore, while the adults were strapped in, the children remained loose, moving freely at 60 miles per hour. But physics does not recognize magic zones. The technical reality was that, in a head-on collision, an unbelted rear passenger doesn't just stay in their seat. They are launched forward with a force multiplied by the vehicle's speed. Therefore, the unbelted child became, quite literally, a human projectile that struck the front seat passenger with enough force to kill both. But the British government, in the early 1980s, still lacked the political courage to mandate rear seatbelts. The libertarian resistance that had fought the 1983 law was still alive, arguing that the government had already taken enough freedom. Therefore, for nearly a decade, Britain lived in a strange legislative limbo. In the front of the car, you were in the era of science. In the back, you were still living in 1955. This discrepancy led to a new wave of grim campaigns. If the 1970s focused on the driver's survival, the late 80s focused on family guilt. This was the birth of the elephant in the backseat metaphor, one of the most powerful pieces of storytelling in advertising history. The premise was simple but terrifying. In a 30-mile-per-hour crash, an unbelted passenger hits the person in front of them with the weight of an elephant. The ads didn't just show the death of the passenger. They showed the passenger killing their own parents. It was a radical shift in storytelling. The government realized that while people might be reckless with their own lives, they were terrified of being the cause of a loved one's death. Therefore, guilt became the ultimate motivator. But it still took until 1989 for rear seatbelts to become mandatory for children, and finally 1991 for all adults. But while behavior was changing, engineering was about to undergo an even deeper revolution. Until the mid-1990s, car manufacturers still held a monopoly on safety data. They conducted their own tests in secret. Therefore, a consumer had no real way of knowing if a Rover was truly safer than a Ford. But everything changed in 1997 with the creation of Euro NCAP. For the first time, an independent body began buying cars directly from showrooms and smashing them into walls, under the glare of high-speed cameras. The initial results were a disaster for the industry. Popular cars that families used every day received ratings of only 1 or 2 stars. The footage was undeniable: steering wheels collapsing, roofs buckling, and dashboards crushing the legs of dummies. But Euro NCAP did something the government never could. It used the market against the manufacturers. No parent wanted to be seen driving a 1-star car. Therefore, safety suddenly became a competitive advantage. Manufacturers who had spent decades saying safety doesn't sell were suddenly scrambling to out-engineer each other for that elusive 5th star. But this race to the top brought a new danger: the illusion of invincibility. Today, we step into a modern SUV and feel like we are in a bunker. We have 10 airbags, autonomous braking, and lane keep assist. But the danger of 1955 has not disappeared. It has merely been camouflaged. Engineers call this risk compensation. When we feel safer, we take more risks. We drive faster. We look at our phones for 1 second longer. We brake later. Therefore, the technological progress is constantly being undermined by our own psychology, but the physics of impact remain absolute. If a 2-ton vehicle stops suddenly, the human brain inside the skull continues to move. No amount of leather trim or digital screens can change the fragility of human biology. The history of British road safety is not, therefore, a story about machines. It is a story about how a nation was forced to face its own mortality. In 1955, we were proud and ignorant. In 1983, we were cautious and traumatized. And today, we are technologically advanced, but dangerously detached from the reality of kinetic energy. But the lesson of the last 70 years is clear: safety is not a state of mind, nor is it a guarantee from a manufacturer. Safety is an act of discipline. It is the click that interrupts our arrogance. As we look at the classic cars of 1955 today, with their gleaming chrome and graceful lines, we must see them for what they really were: beautiful traps. They remind us of a time when aesthetics were more important than anatomy. But the true progress wasn't the invention of the crumple zone or the airbag. The true progress was the destruction of the myth that we could master speed without paying a price. The British government may have used shock tactics and horrific images to convince us, but in the end, they were only teaching us to respect the laws that no parliament can repeal, the laws of motion. Therefore, the next time you hear the sound of your seatbelt clicking into place, remember that the sound is not just a mechanism of nylon and metal. It is the echo of 3 decades of parliamentary debates, thousands of hours of crash tests, and millions of pounds spent on television campaigns designed to scare a nation back to its senses. The click is the sound of a lesson learned in blood, but the question for the future remains: will we continue to listen to that lesson? Or will we need a new era of grim campaigns to remind us that we are still made of flesh and bone in a world of steel and speed? The evolution stopped with the machines, but the fight for the driver's mind continues. Because in the end, the safest car of 1955 and the safest car of today have one thing in common: they are only as safe as the decision of the human being holding the wheel. And that is a truth that no TV campaign, no matter how terrifying, can ever fully change. But as the British learned the hard way between 1955 and 1983, knowing we are in danger is, ironically, the only way to be truly safe.